Devotions with Daniela. We are reading from Daniela's book, Uncultured, about growing up in the religious cult, the Children of God, and then going into the U.S. Army. This is chapter 17, Dazed and Confused. I've just told you all about my wonderful college experience that I went and got before joining the U.S. military. And it might have been all there was to my story if I hadn't met Jeff. He drew all eyes when he walked into my college biology class, tall, with a presence that demanded attention, even at 21. His hawkish green eyes surveyed the room before striding over and sitting on the bench beside me. His hair was perfect, even up close, not a single strand out of place. "I'm Jeff," he said without hesitation. "I'm Danny?" I cringed at the uncertainty in my voice as I scooted farther back on the bench. "Is that a question? Don't you know who you are?" Oh boy. Pretty white American boys were not my type. This Jeff guy was barking up the wrong tree. But Jeff was commanding from day one. He kept barking and I didn't run, though there was part of me that maybe knew I should have, some inner signal that knew something was wrong when guys were so confident. Biology was one of the 3 science classes I had to take to earn my literature degree. The classes where I felt totally out of control and hyper-aware that the fragile life I was cobbling together out of spite and ideas and scholarship and hard work could all be ripped away in a heartbeat. I was terrified I would fail. I was terrified they would realize I was an imposter all along, that I had not truly earned or deserved the seat in which I sat. I was worried they could somehow send me back to wherever I was from. Only in the past several years have I stopped having this dream where they find out my high school diploma is not valid, and so everything I've done in my life is canceled, and I'm like back in high school as a 30-year-old. Maybe that's what he'd been looking for too, that day he chose me. Maybe guys like him have an inner signal too, one that alerts them to pretty girls who hate themselves. But still, he chose me. He was good at science and decided to help me. He said we'd study together, so we did. Again and again, he picked me, and no one had ever taught me how to say no. He'd regale me with tales of his nightly exploits, chasing women before turning and asking me out yet again. I always laughed, explaining I could never date a bigger player than me. If I was honest with myself, it made me feel better that somebody was. I was still getting used to America's strange rules about sex, how it was both bad, but also something everyone was obsessed with. How men wanted girls to be sweet and pure, but also skilled and willing to put out. How someone like Jeff was manly for sleeping with a lot of people, but I could be called a slut for doing the same. Jeff didn't seem to care about any of that. We started hanging out more and more, but it wasn't romantic. It was almost like friends, like I was one of the guys. Almost, but not quite. I couldn't put my finger on it. We spent our evenings at his place studying and talking. He never made me feel unsafe, never did anything. I was so used to men looking at me like they were picturing me with my clothes off, or sucking in their breath when I stood up in an overtly sexy manner. There was always a feeling of self-consciousness, of knowing what was on a guy's mind and wondering what would happen next. I knew how to use that, but not with Jeff. For the first time, maybe in my whole life, I didn't feel objectified. I'd gotten so tired of the story I'd concocted about who I was and where I came from, the loose details I'd strung together about being the kid of international missionaries, of never being able to go deeper than the surface. It was the story I told to everyone, even my close friends, who I still found ways to hold at arm's length. But one day I told him everything, the cult, all of it. And he listened. He was interested, but not in the way other people were interested. Not like the well-meaning school counselors or the people I've met since, with the gleam of voyeuristic thrill in their eyes. Or the ones who ask annoying, stereotypical questions they think they already know the answers to, who tell me I'm nothing like what a cult survivor must be like, even though I'm the first real one they've met. that they know of. Jeff's response was different. Very different. "This sounds like you're coming out," he said. "I've got some advice on that. I used to be gay and had a whole coming out party and everything." And then the conversation pivoted to him. He told me how he decided he was gay in high school because it was the most fabulous crowd to hang out with. He didn't say it in so many words, but I could see through his tough facade how much he'd wanted to be part of a group, to be accepted, the way he never would by his conservative, Southern Baptist Texas world. In his words, he'd been uber gay for 4 years, with cheetah spots dyed into his hair, glitter makeup at school, and same-sex hookups galore. Then, senior year, he fell for a girl, and that was that. End of gayness. The story fascinated me. I was taking a sexuality and gender psychology class and understood that sexuality is a spectrum. I wondered why it was so important for Jeff to be one or the other, why he couldn't allow himself the gray area of being somewhere in the middle, why he had to be so extreme. I looked at the uber masculine man in front of me and tried to imagine him as the uber gay teen boy he'd described, and I couldn't. The high school version of himself seemed like a nice kid, but those guys never had power. So he changed again into the dark-haired, handsome frat boy with a chiseled jaw, sexy forearms, and large-boned hands. The guy who wore a concealed weapon like it was his identity, who was climbing the ranks of his fraternity the way he'd been taught to scale the ladder since birth. The finance and poli-sci major who was going to run the world someday. He was the guy who would ensure he had the prettiest wife, the cutest purebred dog, and the perfect little children running around. He'd made a choice to go down that path, to be the kind of man who'd be a Texas politician. That was not a path for the boy he'd been in high school. I thought he seemed happy. He at least seemed in control. I liked the idea of being in control, of choosing my own destiny. Maybe he could have it all, or at least most of it. Maybe he gave up a part of himself, but it seemed tiny compared to the potential future in front of him. I wondered if I could choose an easier life, like he had, by choosing him. "So," I said, exhaling smoke. He was always trying to command me to quit cigarettes, though he would begrudgingly stand beside me on the tiny apartment deck as I smoked. "What do you think your future wife will think about your history of sleeping with men?" "I imagine I won't tell her," he said, both casual and dismissive. I decided it didn't bother me that he'd slept with more men than he could count. So had I. We slept together that night, and every night after that. We got married less than 2 years later, in the summer after I turned 21, between my junior and senior year, following his graduation from the University of Texas at Dallas, our alma mater. As I prepared to study abroad in Germany for my senior year, I had tried to break things off, but his response was to convince me to marry him instead. He'd wait for me, he said. He'd support me. He told me nobody else would ever love me the way he did, and that made sense to me. So I married William Jeffrey Poole in a destination event in Puerto Vallarta, Mexico. If you're wondering if we triple named him so that you would stop and Google him, yes, we did. In Puerto Vallarta, Mexico, where our parents, Mary, Heaven, and Dougie, were some of the only guests in attendance, because literally everyone else in our lives had warned us not to get married. Then he headed off to U.S. Army basic training, the first step in his plan to become an Army officer, before getting into politics in Texas and enjoying a high-powered career. I had a new name and a husband who promised I wouldn't have to work multiple jobs while I finished school. During my time in Germany, with time away from him to think, I saw that, without realizing it, been so terrified of not having any choices after graduation, or maybe of not knowing what my choices were, that I had accidentally limited them. My husband was in the Army. I would need to follow him. That's what Army wives did. And what was I qualified for anyway? With a BA in English and employment experience as a daycare teacher, fast food worker, balloon sculptor, waitress, and cult video actor. I could be an English teacher at Army bases, trailing him from posting to posting. Then I could become a quiet, well-trained political wife and mother. It sounded like death. It sounded like being controlled. Again. Or, I thought, I could join the army and become an officer too. To put it in chess terms, I'd been forced into taking one of two paths, neither of them good. I remembered my interest in the military from back in high school, the recruiters who kept calling. It seemed reasonable to me then, even exciting. Why not now? I could be anything I wanted in the army, the recruiter had told me repeatedly. I knew I was smart enough, and with a bachelor's degree, I'd have even more options. Maybe it wasn't such a crazy idea to join up, to do something to pay my debt to America. Maybe this would be the thing that would finally prove I really belonged here, that I hadn't tricked everyone into letting me stay. Maybe I'd find a group, a brotherhood, like Jeff said he had. I was at least as good as him. By this time, many of my childhood friends had finally left the cult. Without any education at 19, Mary had gotten pregnant from the family boy she'd been with since the age of 15, and they decided to leave together to give their son a chance at normal. I was glad she was getting out, but worried that she wouldn't have the same opportunities to build her life and find her way that I had, with only one mouth to feed. Almost all of my childhood girlfriends were in similar situations. Micaela had 2 children, the first when she was 19, from 2 different fathers, both of whom wouldn't release custody and were determined to keep their children in Brazil. All of my friends were stuck, trapped in some way or another. And yet I was graduating summa cum laude, the valedictorian of the arts and humanities programs at one of the great American universities, one that paid me for the privilege. I was lucky, too lucky. Any day, I knew that luck could run out. I was lucky simply to be an American after all. I'd won the passport lottery at birth, then pulled myself up by that Social Security card and U.S. passport to make myself exist. My life with Jeff would make me even more secure. If I joined the army, if I commissioned into the army, I would always count. I would officially matter. Jeff liked the idea of his wife being physically fit, knowing how to handle big guns, and having a rank and title that earned her deference. He said it was hot and showed me pictures of flawless World War II era blonde women in belted, drab green perfection. Do I want you to think that this is probably Nazi women he's showing me? Yes, I do. I began to like it too, as though his desires had started to outweigh my own, until my first priority became to please him. Could I shape myself into who he wanted me to be? Besides, he'd remind me, he would always outrank me by 6 months. Lieutenant Poole. It sounded good on him. Maybe it would sound good on me too. Maybe joining the army would help me get over my guilt of using government aid to get my start. Maybe I could feel more like a real American once I'd been in the 1% of those who volunteer to serve. That number is not real. And maybe I could do some good for what seemed like, to me, if not necessarily the best country in the world, at least one of them. What did I have to lose? It was only 3 more years of my life, and Jeff and I would be doing it together. How bad could it be? I wrote my graduation speech, extolling my fellow graduates to follow their passion, the same advice always given to, and usually ignored by, all college graduates. I told myself I was following my passion, that I wanted to do this. And I believed it. I was determined once again to show the world I was right, that I knew how to choose the life and the group that was best for me. I was sure I could be part of the army, but not owned by it. That a person could have brains and independent, innovative thoughts and still be part of a larger group that gave their life purpose, meaning, identity, and structure, even if that culture demanded uniformity. I wouldn't be a brainwashed automaton. I'd be different. I was sure I knew what I was getting into, what I was signing my life over to, and how it would play out. I was wrong. And that brings us to part 3, the army, for another day.